Well, Dana, thank you so much for agreeing to do this with me. It's a pleasure. We had one conversation prior to doing this, and so this is the second time we've had a chance to speak. So I just wanted to put that out there for context. But so perhaps maybe you could explain. I first encountered you through a video that Peter Boghossian put out on his YouTube channel, and I was part of a review show for that video. So perhaps you could give us a sort of thumbnail sketch about how you ended up in Peter's video and what that was like.
So Peter was visiting Australia, and on a particular day, I think it was the end of March, he visited Sydney. He might have been there for more than a day. He might have been there for a while. I'm not sure. But on that particular day was the Day of the Unborn street procession at St. Mary's Cathedral in the Sydney CBD. So St. Mary's Cathedral, for those who don't know, it's the main Roman Catholic cathedral in Sydney. So the Day of the Unborn commemorates those unborn babies who lost their lives to predominantly abortion, but there's miscarriages and there's other reasons why babies would die before being born. So, but sure, you could call it a anti-abortion rally if you want. I would just call it the Day of the Unborn street procession. So after that, I came across Peter doing Street Epistemology, and there was another gentleman there, also from the same street procession. So two Catholics came across Peter doing Street Epistemology. We decided to participate, and the idea of debating, getting involved in a trans debate, so to speak, that was actually my idea. I think the original idea between the three of us. I know there was a blonde lady involved, as we could see in that video. She didn't have too much to say. So it's a fair statement to say between the three of us, we were the more involved ones. We initially started with the idea about debating something to do with science, and the other gentleman was, as you could tell throughout the course of that video, was big on science. And I thought I'd just juice things up by throwing in the fact that I'm trans, and we can have a civilized yet controversial conversation about trans issues.
Awesome, that's fantastic. What inspired you to want to talk about that with a fellow Catholic?
I just wanted to see what buttons I could push, what I could get out of him. I was confident that it wasn't going to be a punch, that it was going to challenge them. And without knowing much about street epistemology, I thought, well, this is the time to do it. We've both just come from the street procession. We have similar pro-life views, but do we have similar views on other social issues? I thought I'd be challenging in an unexpected way. And I don't know the guy from Barbados. I only just met him at the event. So he probably thought, oh, just another woman here for pro-life cause. Well, yes, that's true. But you as in the other gentleman in the video that you can see, you may not necessarily agree that I'm a woman, which is fine, but let's talk about it. And let's get uncomfortable.
Fascinating. He had some it was very difficult to follow some of his reasoning at some points. He made lots of very, very strong and outlandish claims, and some of it seemed very ungenerous to you. I'm wondering what your thoughts were on his views, and are these sort of typical sorts of views you'd encounter? For me, it seemed rather unusual, but I don't know if this is typical in the Catholic spaces that you no doubt encounter people perhaps maybe with similar views, or whether it's unusual even in those spaces.
Let's just say I'm a bit of a taboo topic in Catholic circles, in the sense of not in the sense of exclusion, but in the sense of well, you look like a woman, you're integrating, so to speak. Let's not blow up the situation. That's the vibes I usually get.
Right.
Diners included, but if we know too much, that might complicate things. Whereas he let it loose, but I
You did.
knew that at some point he wasn't gonna. I knew there was a chance. I don't want to assume, but I knew there was a chance that at some point he wasn't going to make sense. And we saw him in the video. At some point, he just didn't make any sense. And I
Very much
think
so.
rather than getting argumentative, I thought we'll just let whatever he decided to present of his own free will, we'll let that speak for itself. As Catholics, we talk a lot about free will, the freedom to choose. Well, he had the freedom to choose to say whatever he wanted. And now others can now judge on internet land. So I can't do anything about that.
Bravo, bravo. I think throughout the conversation, we were all admiring your restraint and calm demeanor and reasoned argument in the face of what seemed like some rather strange perspectives that were coming. I did notice, though, that at one point in the video, he didn't willfully misgender you. I noticed that he referred to you as a she, and I thought that was quite a sweet moment. That was sort of an odd moment where I don't know whether he caught himself doing that or whether, but he said he didn't want to be unkind, which I thought was quite interesting.
So, look,
do you encounter that kind of?
True.
Sorry, my apologies. No, go ahead.
But potentially that's true. I don't know the guy from Bar of Soap.
Sure.
I think one of two things. There's one of two explanations about that. One, he genuinely didn't want to be unkind. Excuse me. Two, he didn't want to be seen, or he may have genuinely wanted to be unkind, but he didn't want to get caught out as a hypocrite. That's one of two explanations.
Interesting. I'm curious about it because he said some very unkind things about somebody in your situation, and I'm not sure whether he just didn't notice that he was being unkind or whether he didn't notice his kindness. It was very curious an experience. Yeah, fascinating. What were your thoughts of Peter and the way he was moderating and engaging in the conversation?
Look, I rocked up. I thought this is interesting, and I just participated, and I didn't pay too much attention to Peter himself. Well, at least not the details of the way he facilitated the whole conversation. But then after watching the review video that you participated in, it helped me to better appreciate what street epistemology is, or should I say should be. It was quite insightful, and in hindsight, yeah, I do tend to agree that it wasn't a bad debate. It wasn't bad debate moderation, but perhaps there should be an admission that maybe this isn't street epistemology. This is a street debate.
That's fascinating. I shared your feedback with the panelists, my fellow panelists on that show, and they were all extraordinarily happy with your assessment. And I think it made us all feel like these review shows did the job in some meaningful way. What would you? This may be unfair because obviously you're very new to it, but how would you categorize street epistemology as you might understand it now? What would you say we are trying to do or promote in the world?
I would describe it as street epistemologists carrying the legacy of Socrates and making it happen in the year 2023. 2023.
Bravo. I think in essence that would be about right. Yeah, we try to encourage people to critically think, and we use Socratic questioning tools to do that. And It doesn't matter what the topic is, and yeah, it's interesting. And one of the things I think we all felt, you probably you will have heard us say, is that we felt that there was something really interesting in the conversation, which was that the gentleman whose views were quite outlandish at parts, was largely seemingly deriving his worldview from Catholicism, which was a view that you both shared, and obviously that I thought that was rather fascinating, and I wondered how you reflected on that. Why somebody could come, two people with essentially a shared philosophical worldview might come to such disparate perspectives on an issue that's clearly important to you.
I think if you took all the emotions out of it, our worldviews wouldn't be too different. Sometimes, or should I say a lot of times, it's not about the point someone is actually making. It's a lot of times it's more about how they're making that point. So if we look at first few chapters of Genesis, what can we get out of that? Like factually, without getting into the emotions. That we're designed to be men and women and women are designed in a particular way so that we can continue, we can bring about the human race and continue the human race. So as you can see, I've explained it in a way that takes out a lot of the emotions. So I he could, if he took out all the emotions, he would say something similar, because we're just factually stating what's in the first few chapters of Genesis in the Bible. So I could then, without deviating too much from his worldviews, Catholic worldviews, I could then say, having said that, as we saw with before in chapter 3 of Genesis, so clearly human beings are not perfect. That's what chapter 3 is trying to demonstrate. Eve started having doubts whether to trust God, so to speak, just be trusting of what he's brought about. So she went off and ate the forbidden fruit. So in other words, we're imperfect. So if we're imperfect, well, I have my imperfections, and that gentleman also has his imperfections, such as potentially using uncharitable words in that video. So it's kind of like touche. It's just like, yeah, I've decided to transition genders, and you just decided to use uncharitable words. So cool story. We're both fallen. We're both imperfect. What's new?
That's
like honestly, what's new? Like I know that gender transitioning is more of a 20th, 21st century thing, but honestly, in human history terms, what's new? It so happens that there's some imperfection about me. Okay, now what?
So I can't help but, when I hear you say that, I can't help but feel a little bit sad that you would see it as an imperfection. I wonder if that's part of the Catholicism narrative that maybe isn't as helpful. I mean, in this sense, do you feel is your relationship to that idea a negative one, or when you say imperfection, is it more a textual thing that humanity has is multifaceted in some meaningful way, or do you genuinely mean it as an imperfection?
The fact that human beings are multifaceted is a strong indicator in itself of how imperfect we are. And I think we have to be careful in not viewing these things negatively. Negatively or positively. It's just, yep, this is a fact of life. So what are we going to do about it? How can we best go about it? How can we best approach it? And as it turns out, as I highlighted in the video between the other gentleman and Peter, well, I've made choices. I've made choices in life that I felt helped me make the situation bearable. By my late teens, it was very clear to me that I felt the need to transition genders. Otherwise, like yes, I'm designed in a particular way, so to speak, but it was just too much. So then the question is, okay, so I transition genders. So moving forward, once I've done that, moving forward, what does that mean? Well, that doesn't mean I can't strive for perfection in other areas in my life. Such as if I get involved in a street debate, don't be like the other guy. Like if one is imperfect in one sense, well, maybe that should be an incentive to find other ways to be perfect. And that way, it's giving myself, putting religion aside, it's a good way, I suppose, of giving myself goals to strive for to make me better. Not perfect, better, overall. So.
Yeah, perfection is the enemy of the good, I think, is the old adage. I like it. Wonderful stuff. I think there's a few things. One is, I think we should mention. So you're am I correct in remembering that you're studying theology? Is that right? You're doing a degree in theology. Did I misremember that?
That's correct. It's a master's in theology at the University of Notre Dame in Sydney.
Wonderful, wonderful. One of the I thought that was just useful context for anybody listening. You are very well versed in your subject matter. I think one of the moments I think in the video that really struck me was when I thought Peter asked a rather abrasive question of you, which is, do you think you'll ever regret your decision? I may be mischaracterizing the question, but it was something of that term. And I thought that was quite a sort of shockingly abrupt question. Peter has a tendency to be a little abrupt, I think, sometimes. And I was really impressed with your answer. I think everybody else on the panel was, which was, I think you suggested that you might regret it. Maybe you couldn't be 100% confident this was the right thing to do, but that I think you mentioned you'd lived so far 10 years after having made this decision and never regretted it yet, and I thought that was just incredible because, normally I think in these situations, especially when I was going to say that you could feel attacked, but I think you, in some meaningful sense, you were being a sort of attacked. You're by the gentleman, and to a certain extent by Peter's question. And I think there's always a tendency in those spaces to be hyperbolic, to sort of be overcorrect and be very defensively, strong in your opinion. I would never regret that. I would never, this is totally beyond even consideration. And I was really impressed with your ability to not react defensively and just be able to give the most cogent and coherent answer to what is essentially a rather rude question. What do you think it is about you that enables you to do this? What is this magical characteristic that you seem to have?
So in Catholicism, we talk about faith and reason going hand in hand. So faith, we know what faith is, but just as importantly, reason, which is why one of probably, or there's a tendency for me to be hyperbolic now, I should say. St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the fathers of Catholic philosophy, not the father of Catholic philosophy. So as you can see, I'm trying not to be hyperbolic. He, in medieval times, he wrote a whole bunch of stuff, philosophical stuff, to support the Catholic faith using Aristotle. So in other words, reason, and to demonstrate why faith is just as important as reason, and they both go hand in hand. So what do we mean by reason? Well, okay, let's be reasonable about this. I transitioned more than a decade ago. Is there any evidence, any indicators to suggest that this may not have been the right decision for me? Okay, we want to be objective about it. Sure, I can't have children. Does the Catholic Church teach if you don't find a spouse and have children, you're sinning or words to that effect. No, because then your priests, your sisters, nuns, your religious orders, they'd be sinning. So clearly, by medically transitioning, I can't have children. Did I sin? Did I sin in the sense of now I can't have children? No, because for the reasons I just outlined. So okay, why did I any other indicators to show that I would regret? So what is sin? Sin is missing the mark, and why is missing the mark a problem? It's a problem because if you're missing the mark, that may not necessarily lead to happiness. Do I feel unhappy? Well, I feel that what probably should have happened to begin with was being born biologically female. Of course, that hasn't happened. So I'm just dealing with the situation the best I can. But there's no evidence of regret. So, am I meant to internally beg that I'll regret? Well, that comes across as silly. So,
wonderful, fascinating. I think I would be remiss if I didn't ask you. I mean, you're such a rational and articulate advocate for your views. I would love to, if it's okay, can we talk about your Catholicism? It's an old habit from the Street Epistemology community that religion's sort of the old adversary in some ways. But we definitely find it as an interesting a topic as any other, I think. And but yeah, I would love to ask you about that. If you're okay with me asking some questions about it, wonderful. So, when did you become Catholic? Were you born to a Catholic family, or did you adopt Catholicism later in life?
I was raised Catholic. I come from a Catholic family. During my teenage years, I lapsed. A lot of Catholic kids did. I lapsed because I just didn't have the maturity to try to reconcile being trans and being Catholic. Now, note that this is the early 2000s when I started lapsing. So, if I didn't have a mentor, so to speak, to help me understand, well, it's only logical that I lapsed. Life went on, I transitioned. Then a few years ago, I was going through some rough patches in life. I then decided to turn back to the faith. So I didn't immediately turn back to the Catholic faith, but I started re-exploring the Christian faith, see what's out there. So yes, as part of my church shopping, so to speak, I did try out a few Hillsong style, charismatic churches along the way. I eventually found that it's very emotional, and it's not that I'm unable to be emotional. Sometimes when I'm approaching certain subject matters, I need to see the sense of it without the emotion. So it was just too much. So then I decided during 2020, so during the pandemic, okay, maybe I should have a look. I need to re-examine my Catholic faith that I was raised with. So then the year after, I started doing my theology master's part-time at Australia's premier traditional Catholic university. So the subjects I've taken, most of which are facilitated, lectured by religious order men and women. And that made the most sense. Hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I So another important question about regret. Do I regret that? No. It's I've matured enough to try to reconcile the two. So it's not about finding some Bible quote. Oh, see, this shows that, like one of the quotes. So one of the things that's un-Catholic to do is pick up a Bible, find some quote that appears convenient for to support one's worldview, and then use it to Bible bash. That would be a very un-Catholic thing to do. People who do that, they're probably not Catholic, and then there's a question of, are they Christian or are they Bible believers? Because in my view, they're two very different things. A Bible believer picks up a book and believes the Bible. But are they Christian because there's a Christian tradition that's not just all about the Bible? It should be based on the Bible. So one of the criticisms Catholicism gets is, oh, you add in, there's too much philosophy to it, blah, blah, blah. Well, it's not just about a piece of book, so to speak. In fact, at one point, it wasn't a book, it was all verbal. I mean, at some point, people decided to put pen to paper, and as we say, put pen to paper in a way that was inspired by the Holy Spirit. So, like, it wasn't actually all written to begin with. It was all verbal.
Right.
And so, I think a more honest approach would be, so one of what I could do is, there's a Ethiopian Jewish eunuch. I think it was in somewhere in the Bible, and I've seen that used as an example of being trans. Well, actually, very different cultural contexts. A eunuch, a biblical eunuch, is not the same as a contemporary trans person. Not a great comparison. I'm not a fan of that picking and choosing. I find that that's not necessarily a Christian thing to do. A Christian thing to do would be, okay, well, what does the Bible say about a whole bunch of things overall? It's about big themes. And then applying big themes in a reasonable way to our contemporary times.
Interesting. So they're looking for contemporary references almost by sort of reinterpreting certain lines and specific wording. Interesting. So I'm very empathetic to the reasons why some people, and maybe actually I say I'm empathetic, that you might consider this uncharitable, but I can see why a lot of people might find comfort in a religious framework and a religious ideal. To what extent would you say Catholicism or the principles of Catholicism were true, rather as opposed to potentially comforting or useful? If you had to put in street epistemology, we often talk about confidence scales, like how confident. I think, Peter, that was kind of the question: how confident would you be on a scale of 0 to 100 that your transition was a good idea or something? I think you said 75 or something. It's just a useful gauge so that we don't misunderstand. When somebody expresses themselves in favor of a particular perspective, it's easy to assume that maybe they're utterly 100% convinced, but actually maybe there is some room for uncertainty there. So on that basis, how would you characterize your confidence in the truth of Catholicism?
If I wanted to bring emotions to it, I could say I'm 100% confident. But there's a reason why we have the 80-20 rule. We talk about, in secular talk, we talk about the 80% solution. If we were seeking 85%, 90%, it then brings into question whether we've approached this in whatever the matter may be, in a reasonable way. So, if I was to say I'm 95 or even 100% confident about the Bible and about the teachings of the Catholic Church, etc., etc. It just provokes questions of that implies, that may or may not imply, that overconfident. I'm being too confident, and I may not I may not be approaching religion clinically. Now, other Christians will argue, well, that's a very unchristian thing to do, to be so clinical. Well, how I need to come across as reasonable, safe, reason. Like, if I come across as too emotional about religion, how's that a good thing for evangelization? I just can't see it. So you see the random guy or random girl on the street that's preaching the good news. Are they effective? I'm just struggling to see the effectiveness.
Mm.
What would be more effective is, say, you rock up to some other social event that didn't have, if that was non-religious, may or may not have religious people, and then someone strikes a conversation with you, figure out your interests, and then you might say, oh, I go to mass every Sunday. And then if they're interested, they may not be religious themselves, but if they're interested, you could start a conversation about that. And if you go about it the right way, you may leave an impression, maybe not at the end of that conversation, maybe at the end of, after a few conversations or what have you, where if one represents their religion in the best light, that's helpful to all, that's more effective. But standing in the streets and doing, I would argue, doing exactly how preaching was done 2,000 years ago, there's questions about how effective it is. It's highly questionable.
So would you describe this as preaching in a way that's appealing to emotion versus appealing to logic and reason? Is this the dichotomy you're describing? And maybe I'm not following exactly.
It's something along those lines.
Right.
So if say you're evangelizing on the streets in a way that you've got a microphone, you're preaching the Bible, but no one's really approaching you, and that's been going on for a couple of weeks, are you effective?
Of course, yeah.
The evidence, so being reasonable, the evidence would suggest maybe not. Maybe think about other ways of doing it. And then, of course, you also have to be careful that if you do get an audience, you're not just ending up preaching to the converted. No pun intended. Like, I know marketing is a secular thing, but in Christendom, we talk a lot about being in the world, not part of the world. So maybe some marketing tips have something to offer. Just saying.
I interviewed a former Mormon, post-Mormon. I always, whenever I talk about this, I never remember which is the polite way of framing it. Apparently some Mormons or former Mormons or post-Mormons feel quite emotional about some of these labels for various reasons. But in any case, he was explaining how street epistemology as a movement that's going out into the streets and encouraging people to reflect and wants to sort of talk to people about interesting and potentially important but maybe sensitive topics. He actually recommended that we read the Mormon guidebook on engaging in missionary work, because he said they've done so much work in this space. They will go out in groups and they're very effective at what they do, and their guidebook is genuinely worth following. And there's a religion that has become very good at advocating for itself in a very specific way. I would imagine you would not believe that this is representative of somehow the truth of the claim, just the effectiveness of the mechanisms they're using to encourage people to engage with it.
Well, I would argue that Mormons, so the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, they're Jesus followers. I wouldn't argue that they're Christian. So in my view, if someone who claims to be Christian but they won't recite, say, the Nicene Creed, which is basically a statement of the Christian faith, are you Christian? Or are you a Jesus follower? Or are you a Bible believer? Or are you a God worshipper? Which all sounds like Christian labels, but that's different to being actual Christian. So, yes, the Mormons, they're effective and they took up those marketing tips. And, we could learn from that. So, they'll do what they need to do, and there's obviously some level of effectiveness to it. Something to learn from.
So going back to your characterization, so I guess going back to your reflection, then I think you suggested that you could emotionally support the idea of the truth of the Catholic faith at 100%. I don't know if you expressed how you might rationally represent that view.
Okay, so one claim we could look. I'm going to dumb this down. One argument
Please do.
One really simple, simplistic argument I would make for the existence of God.
Okay.
So, so you and I can do maths in our heads, in our minds. Mm-hmm. 1 + 1 = 2, but then obviously maths can be way more complex than that. Whilst we're doing those kind of maths in our minds, simple or complex, actually, when we look at the entire universe, we see maths everywhere. We can, from an astrophysics perspective, you see the maths out there in our Milky Way, etc. So the fact that maths in our mind is also applicable to literally everywhere in the universe would tell me that there is potentially a supreme mind out there. Who could that supreme mind be? Now,
interesting.
I've really dumbed down the God argument, but that's we're limited on time, so that's me applying. That's me not just applying what's written in the Bible; it's also applying some form of philosophy. That's really, really dumbed down.
So mathematics is a fascinating concept, and there is some significant debate as to whether mathematics was something that was discovered or invented. And that's an interesting concept that I think is definitely worth some consideration, and might really mean something in terms of its answer. But I think what it would be if it was discovered, what it is if it's discovered, I'm not sure is necessarily clear in my view. But I think fundamentally, if it was invented, or at least in the way that we use mathematics, it's merely a model that seems to comport with representing ideas that seem to exist in the external reality. So we use mathematics as a way of describing in abstract terms what we observe in real terms. So it in that sense, if it was truly just a something that we created, it would make sense that the thing we created to help us understand and describe what we observe in reality was also observed in reality in some meaningful way. Would that make sense?
So the model was created, in my view, in order to discover realities. So it's both created and discovered.
Interesting. So just before, so one thing I should just go back to a little bit, though. I think interestingly that obviously the claim for the existence of God is a separate claim to the truth of the Catholic Church being specifically the specific God defined by the Catholic Church, etc. So I like the. How confident would you say? I mean, could you put yourself on a confidence scale from maybe 0 to 100 on whether or not there is a God of any sort that exists in a meaningful way?
I'd still go back to 80%.
80%. Gotcha. I gotcha.
Of course, when I'm at Mass, I don't feel 80%. I feel something much higher than 80%.
So I like to talk about the idea of de facto truth, something that we're sufficiently confident about that we treat it as if it's true, and that's often, I think, what humans do. You know, we don't have 100% confidence in a lot of things, or at least if we do, we're tending to be slightly hyperbolic or overestimating. So we just have to be confident enough to act in a certain way in the world with confidence, and I think 80% would get you to act. I don't think there's many things in the universe that I would be more than 80% confident about if I'm being truly honest about my view. So that's cool. I understand, I think, where you're coming from there, and I think what I would say is, well, okay, so here's a classic street epistemology question. So then what would be the biggest reason for you personally that gets you to the 80% confidence? Because 80% is quite a high degree of confidence. What's the biggest reason in your mind that would represent why you're so confident that this is true, that there is a God in the universe?
So I look at the Bible. It talks about who God is. How do we know God exists? We can extrapolate all that information from the Bible. Okay, so where did the Bible come from? It was all written down, and we say when it was written down, it was inspired by the Holy Spirit. Who wrote it down? Well, people who were inspired by the Holy Spirit. How do we know it's true? Well, there were witnesses. So in Christianity, we talk a lot about being witness. So being witness to God, being witness, etc. So yeah, a whole bunch of witnesses historically wrote a whole bunch of things down, and now we call it the Bible. It's a historical record. Is it all historically factual, which is different to historically true? Just because something is true doesn't mean it's a fact. So we need to differentiate that. When we're talking about facts, we're probably talking about scientifically tested, etc., etc. But if something's true, it's because it's something we believe. We believe that to be a reflection of reality. That's why we call it true. So is the Bible true? Yes. Is it scientifically factual? Like, was, the Earth made 6,000 years ago, blah, blah. Well, science now shows us, no, it wasn't made 6,000 years ago. But the first few chapters of Genesis, that's basically biblical poetry. It's Hebrew poetry, and maybe we should cut the Jews some slack here, because they didn't have the scientific tools they have today. They were trying to make sense of reality in a way that they could eventually put pen to paper, and that's now part of the Bible. So it's worth cutting the Jews at the time some slack. They were trying their best to make sense of reality, not engage in a rigorous scientific process. So that's the Bible. And, what does, so that's faith, and what does reason have to offer? Well, we look to philosophy. So that argument I made about maths in the mind, maths in the universe, therefore supreme mind, surely, I've basically dumbed down Aquinas's. So I mentioned earlier Thomas Aquinas.
Ontological argument.
I dumbed down his 5 ways, so to speak, which comes from Aristotle. And then you smash the whole thing together, and there's your 80%.
So, if the Bible wasn't true, if I could somehow, I would not. Imagine hypothetically, I could somehow prove that the Bible wasn't either factual or true in some way. How would that? You've still got then, I guess, Aquinas's argument. So I guess I'm wondering what percentage of confidence you'd still have if I could disprove that the Bible was true somehow. Would you? How would that affect your confidence, do you think?
Well, if you could successfully prove it, it's untrue, it's unfactual, etc., I then think that just makes me an Aquinas / Aristotle worshipper.
Okay,
So then I
fair
just
enough.
default to that.
So what this is doing? So in street epistemology, what we're doing is I'm doing what's called real reason checking. So sometimes when you're engaging in conversations with people and they hold a belief, whatever that belief is, it doesn't have to be religious, but a belief about anything. They will often express a lot of things that give them confidence in their position. But if you were to say, if this was not true, would you still hold the position? Sometimes they'll say, yes, I would still hold the position, as you're doing. So it would seem that at the very least your position is being supported by both the Aristotle perspective, the Aquinas position, and the truth of the Bible. But for example, you might come across somebody who maybe expresses a confidence because of something, and then you say, would it change your mind if that wasn't true? And they'd say, absolutely not. No, I'd still be 100%. I'd still be very confident. So this is just trying to identify what the key components of your epistemology are for supporting this position. I'm sure you must. I'm sure you must, but maybe I'd be wrong. But do you, in your theology studies, do you look at arguments against the Aquinas position? Because it's an old chestnut, as these things go. So have you studied much of the counter arguments against Aquinas, or some of the I guess what would it be? Counter apologetics against the position?
I haven't studied that too closely. I mean, look, let's be frank. I've chosen to do theology studies at a traditional Catholic uni. So you could say that I'm going there for confirmation bias. But there's a reason for that. It's I want to develop my faith. So if I wasn't there to develop my faith, well, what am I doing there? I might as well go to another uni to study philosophy. But so no, I haven't looked into counter apologetics. I can imagine what that may look like, and I can, touch the surface of it. I haven't gone deep into it because it's counter to this journey I'm on. If I wasn't interested in the journey, well, sure, but I'd look into counter apologetics through some philosophy degree at some other uni. So
I understand that's. I once again I commend your honesty and self-awareness. I think it's. I suspect it's partly the Australian culture coming. Every Australian I've had the pleasure of encountering. I think at the very least I could describe as a plain speaker, and it's something I genuinely love about Australians. I think that's so. Honestly, I would like to ask you a little bit more about your journey, but I'm realizing we're sort of running out of time here, and it's incredibly early in the morning for you. What can you just? Is it like 5 o'clock in the morning? Did you say?
When we started, it's now getting close to 6
when we started. So, oh my gosh, I'm so I feel like we could talk a lot more, and I would genuinely love to do that. So maybe we can continue the conversation either in further videos, or we could discuss it elsewhere. But honestly, Dana, once again I just want to say thank you so much for doing this. I mean, getting up at 5 a.m. already is heroic, but I really appreciate you watching our review video. I think that was amazing that you did that, and I genuinely, hand on heart, hope that you become a member of the Street Epistemology community, because I think you'd be a fantastic asset to us all, and I think you'd really enjoy it as well. I can definitely see you. I definitely think I could see you embracing its ideals, because I think you already exemplify so many of them seemingly naturally of your own accord. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say other than I really hope we get to do this again, and thank you so much for being here and doing this.
It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.